She earned nicknames that spoke of immortality. Big Ben, the unsinkable fortress, the Iron Queen of the Pacific. Yet when dawn broke on March 19, 1945, this floating kingdom became a blazing coffin. 800 souls vanished in heartbeats. Those who lived through it spoke in whispers afterward. The steel beneath our feet turned liquid. The ship wailed like something alive and dying. How could a single wounded Japanese pilot accomplish what entire enemy fleets had failed to do? Why did this burning tomb refuse to slip beneath the waves? Spring of 1945 found the Pacific transformed. No longer a theater of war. Now it resembled an ocean-sized cemetery waiting for fresh graves. Task Force 58 commanded these waters with overwhelming force. Every morning brought waves of American aircraft. Hellcats screamed from carrier decks. Avengers dove like metallic hawks. Corsairs swept the skies clean of resistance. The Japanese homeland lay bleeding under constant assault. At the center of this steel armada sailed Franklin. She stretched longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. Her hull contained more than 3,000 men. Her magazines bulged with hundreds of tons of explosives. The crew saw her as indestructible. Enemy forces viewed her as the hammer of doom itself. Big Ben appeared beyond the reach of mortal weapons. Dawn light over the Pacific that morning painted everything in sharp detail. Franklin's flight deck hummed with pre-mission activity. Pilots pulled on leather gloves. They checked fuel gauges one final time. They armed their bombs with practiced efficiency. Rows of aircraft crouched like caged predators. Their bellies swelled with deadly cargo. Aviation fuel dripped from their wings. Deck crews moved in perfect rhythm. Loading rockets, rolling bombs into position, filling fuel tanks to capacity. The air carried scents of sweat and oil and absolute confidence. A young sailor would remember years later. Nothing seemed capable of touching us. We felt like gods of the storm itself. War feeds on such pride. In that deceptive calm, Japan forged its reply. Not through massive fleets or brilliant strategy. Through pure desperation. Their empire crumbled around them. Their air force bled white. From this collapse emerged a terrible new weapon. Men willing to become living fire. The Kamikaze. Divine wind warriors. They flew not to return. They flew to die killing. Franklin floated just 50 miles from Japan's shores, well within range of these human missiles. American commanders understood the threat, yet their pride dulled the edge of caution. Task Force 58 had survived the worst Japan could offer. They had shattered the Imperial Navy at Philippine Sea. They had burned Truk Lagoon to ash. They had turned Japanese skies into mass graves. Confidence had evolved beyond strategy. It had become religious faith. The contrast that morning defined the coming tragedy perfectly. A massive fortress bristling with destruction facing one broken attacker. Americans possessed overwhelming firepower. The Japanese carried something far more dangerous: complete desperation. Big Ben's flight deck shimmered under morning sunlight. Aircraft lined up like loaded dice waiting to be thrown. The crew believed those dice belonged to them. Fate had already determined the numbers. One pilot, one dying machine, one desperate plunge. These elements would strip the mask of invincibility from America's proudest carrier. The stage stood ready. Franklin approached not a battle, but a reckoning. Morning light at 07:08 hours tore apart like fabric. From pale clouds crawled a single shadow. A Yokosuka D-4Y Judy bomber. Smoke leaked from her wounded frame. Her wings shuddered as death embraced her fuselage. Yet this Judy carried more than bombs now. She had transformed into something beyond mere aircraft. a vengeful spirit with singular purpose. Franklin's gunners spotted the approaching threat. Anti-aircraft weapons erupted. Tracers stitched deadly patterns across the sky. The Judy danced through this steel rain. Shells burst behind her. Explosions tore chunks from empty air. Never quite close enough to stop her. She pressed forward, ignoring the hurricane of metal. One sailor whispered afterward, "She seemed to choose us specifically. Like she could see through every bullet we fired. Nothing could turn her away from her target." The Judy rolled into a shallow dive. Wings trembling with effort. Cockpit glass caught the rising sun. Her aim ignored the sea below, ignored the hull beneath. She dove straight for the heart. The flight deck where armed planes waited, fuel tanks full, bomb bays loaded, every carrier's vulnerable spot. One spark in that crowded space could unleash hell itself. Impact came not as sound, but as eruption. Steel screamed in agony. The deck split wide. Franklin instantly ceased being a warship. She became a volcano. Flames leapt toward the sky. Black smoke billowed like death itself. Bombs beneath parked aircraft began cooking off. One explosion triggered another. Thunder rolled across the Pacific. Aviation gasoline poured everywhere. Every surface became a river of fire. Corsairs transformed into torches. Hellcats melted where they sat. Armed rockets launched themselves wildly, screaming through the inferno like demons unleashed. Men fled. Men burned. Men simply vanished. Within heartbeats, 800 sailors and aviators were gone. Some incinerated instantly, others shredded by metal fragments that sliced through steel bulkheads. The pride of Task Force 58 shrieked like a wounded animal. Her metal skin buckled, her soul torn wide open. One survivor recalled decades later, "I watched a shipmate standing right beside me. Flash of light. He disappeared. Not burned, not broken, just gone completely." The shock went beyond the dead. It struck the living with terrible realization. Invincibility was illusion. This carrier built to rain destruction had become her own executioner. Her greatest strength betrayed her. Rows of loaded planes, rivers of fuel, mountains of ordnance, all turned against their masters. Task Force 58 spread across surrounding waters, watched in horror. One strike. Single aircraft. Their iron colossus bleeding out before their eyes. Franklin refused to sink. She would not surrender to the sea. In that refusal lay deeper tragedy. She had become a floating crematorium, a drifting volcano. Every blast shook the souls of those still trapped inside her burning hull. Japan needed no great armada. One desperate man. One machine in its death throes. These proved sufficient to expose the truth. Power itself carries the deadliest weakness. As Franklin burned, the question changed. Not whether she could fight. Whether anyone aboard could survive the firestorm consuming her. The initial blast ripped Franklin's heart out, yet the ship clung to existence. She burned. She screamed. She bled steel and human lives. Between survival and destruction, she drifted. Her crew faced an impossible choice: submit to the flames or fight the unfightable. Fire crawled across the flight deck like a living thing, consuming aircraft like paper models. Explosions came in waves. 500-pound bombs detonated in sequence, hurling steel shards through corridors, splitting bodies from shadows. Rockets designed for Japanese targets turned traitor, launching blindly through bulkheads, piercing men with fire and metal. A sailor remembered years afterward. The ship no longer belonged to us. Fire owned her completely. Every step we took tried to kill us. Trained firefighting teams had perished in the first moments. Untrained men took their place, desperate volunteers. Cooks abandoned their ladles for water hoses. Clerks left typewriters for buckets of seawater. Mechanics wrapped wet cloth around their faces, crawled into the inferno itself. They fought without strategy. Pure instinct drove them, dragging hoses across decking that melted under their boots, heaving burning bombs over the rail, each one hissing as it hit the ocean. They smashed into compartments, flooding them with salt water, choking fire before it reached the main magazines. Lieutenant Joseph Tausig led these suicide missions. He and his team entered the hangar. Bombs glowed red-hot, seconds from detonation. "We threw them out like bricks from a furnace," he said later. "Every one we touched might have been our last." Fire showed no mercy. It roared louder, feeding on gasoline, feeding on terror. Franklin groaned, her hull shaking as if she too wanted to collapse into the depths. Through smoke and chaos, a figure appeared. Father Joseph O'Callaghan, the ship's Catholic chaplain. No officer of war. He carried no weapons. Yet in that moment, he became the anchor point. Cross hanging around his neck, fire reflecting in his spectacles. He rallied the broken, blessed the dying, comforted the wounded. Then turned to the living and commanded them back into flames. One survivor said afterward, "He never shouted orders, simply told us what needed doing." When he walked into that fire, we followed him. Men formed human chains, passing water, carrying wounded sailors, dragging hoses deeper into the furnace. Every explosion threatened to scatter them, yet each moment of defiance carved another piece of ship back from death. Hours blurred together. Smoke filled every lung. Skin blistered from heat. Muscles failed from exhaustion. Yet the impossible began happening. The inferno slowed its advance. The beast was not killed, but contained. By nightfall, Franklin still floated, blackened, broken, her decks shattered, her planes reduced to ash. 800 dead lay beneath twisted steel, their names carved into silence forever. Yet more than 1,000 remained alive, saved because ordinary men defied fire itself. The ship had been betrayed by her own strength, saved by human will that refused abandonment. Franklin was no longer a war machine. She had become a scarred carcass drifting in hostile seas. Inside her smoldering hull, life held on. The battle for survival was just beginning. Franklin drifted half dead, only 50 miles from Japan's coast. A bleeding carcass trailing smoke. A tomb of twisted steel. 800 men gone. Hundreds more broken. Engines silent. Radar blind. Planes destroyed. Enemy forces could strike again at any moment. Defense was impossible. Survival demanded miracles. Deep in the engine rooms below, deck engineers clawed through darkness. Water dripped from broken pipes. Steam hissed like angry serpents. The air was poison. Yet Chief Machinist's mate A.C. Williams and his crew refused to abandon their posts. Their mission was resurrection, bringing the beast back to life. One survivor remembered it afterward. Felt like crawling into hell itself. Every breath burned our lungs. But if we left, Franklin would die there. Piece by piece, they coaxed life back into ruined boilers. Emergency generators never designed for such strain groaned under the burden. Pumps and lights demanded power. After 2 days of sweat and burns and madness, a miracle flickered to life. One boiler roared awake. Steam coursed through arteries of steel. Franklin trembled, not in death throes, but in motion. She could move again, slowly, painfully. She lived. Above deck, the fight was against despair. Captain Garris had been evacuated wounded. Many believed the ship was lost. Some whispered of total abandonment. 2 men refused to surrender. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Gary, half choked from smoke. He roamed shattered compartments, rallying survivors. "Get back to your stations," he barked. "This ship is not finished while we still breathe." At the center stood Father Joseph O'Callaghan, chaplain, not commander. Yet he became Franklin's soul, moving among burned and broken men, blessing them, then turning to the able-bodied, demanding they fight for their ship. His calm voice cut through chaos. His cross became a banner of defiance. "He gave us orders," a sailor recalled. "Not military commands, human ones. And we obeyed them." Together they restored weapons by hand. A 5-inch gun, silent for hours, barked back to life. Handful of 20mm cannons patched with sweat and wire stood ready. Franklin, crippled and staggering, was no longer helpless prey. She could still bite back. Salvation arrived from the sea. Light cruiser USS Santa Fe braved the firestorm, edging alongside the burning giant. Her crew pulled more than 300 survivors from Franklin's decks. 2 ships, 1 wounded, 1 whole, clinging together like brothers in a storm. Heavy cruiser USS Pittsburgh arrived next. With cables thick as chains of fate, she lashed herself to Franklin. Engines strained, steel groaned. Slowly the dead carrier began moving, towed away from enemy waters, away from Japan's reaching claws. The journey home lasted weeks, over 5,000 miles of ocean. Through storms and lurking submarines, Franklin crawled forward. Every mile cost sweat and pain and iron will. Men who refused to quit. One sailor said years later, "She should have sunk a dozen times over, but we carried her on our backs. We dragged her home ourselves." Franklin had been struck down by a single plane, yet she rose again, carried not by engines or guns, but by human defiance made manifest. When she finally reached safety, scarred and blackened, she was no longer just a warship. She had become proof itself. Proof that even in the deepest inferno, willpower can bend steel, can drag the dead back to life. When Franklin finally limped into New York Harbor in April 1945, silence fell over gathered crowds. She was not the proud warship they had sent to sea. She was a ghost returning from hell itself. Flight deck torn open, hull blackened beyond recognition, scars visible from miles away. 807 men lost, hundreds more marked for life. The ship floated, but carried the weight of a graveyard. Reporters called her the ship that refused to die. Sailors called her something else. The tomb that came home, a witness recalled afterward. When families saw her, they understood immediately. This was not victory. This was survival purchased in blood. The consequences cut deep into history. Tactically, Franklin shattered the myth of invincibility. Essex-class carriers had been proclaimed unsinkable juggernauts, strength beyond challenge. Franklin's agony revealed harsh truth. A single desperate strike could tear open their hearts. One bomb in the wrong place could turn power into weakness, could make strength betray itself. The Navy learned immediately. Future carriers would not repeat Franklin's fate. Flight decks received thicker armor reinforcement. Fuel lines and bomb storage were redesigned, buried deeper, protected with fire barriers. Firefighting systems multiplied throughout the fleet. Franklin burned so her sisters might live. Strategically, she proved the Kamikaze's terrible power. Japan had lost the war in numbers, in ships and planes and men. But suicide strikes exposed a frightening fact. Desperation could wound even the strongest empire. America rushed the proximity fuse into service. Radar shells that exploded near their targets, tearing Kamikaze apart before they could touch American steel. Franklin's pain wrote the blueprint for surviving the divine wind. The deepest scars were not carved into metal. They lived in men's memories. Rumors spread that Franklin's crew had abandoned ship. Survivors were branded as cowards. Medals were withheld. Questions lingered for years. Whispers haunted those who had fought through fire and hell itself. Not until the Navy investigated. Until testimonies emerged. The truth was finally restored. Two names shone through the smoke: Father Joseph O'Callaghan and Lieutenant Commander Donald Gary, the chaplain who walked into fire carrying a cross, the officer who gathered men from smoke-filled quarters and led them back to fight. Both received the Medal of Honor, the only two ever awarded to carrier sailors in the entire war. Their courage became Franklin's redemption. Yet for most, there were no medals, only memory. A sailor decades later stood before Franklin's rusting hull, whispered quietly, "She never let us go completely. We carried her home, but she carried our dead forever." Franklin's return was not a victory parade. It was a funeral march in steel, a reminder that victory is never free, that even the mightiest can bleed, that survival sometimes costs more than defeat itself. Her scars became her legacy. Her wounds became her warning. She was the most heavily damaged carrier ever to return to port. She was the symbol of American endurance. But above all, she was a monument to those 807 men who never saw land again. Men whose lives were stolen in seconds, whose sacrifice forged lessons that saved countless others. Franklin did not sink into the depths, but she was never whole again afterward. She lived on not as a weapon, but as a scar etched into history itself. An eternal reminder that in war power without humility invites tragedy, that sometimes survival itself is the greatest victory possible. USS Franklin survived her ordeal, but she never truly returned from that March morning. She became legend not of triumph, but of scars, her twisted decks, her burned hull, her shattered soul. All remained etched in memory long after World War II's guns fell silent. For the Navy, Franklin became a teacher carved in steel. She demonstrated that no warship, regardless of size or power, could ever be truly invulnerable. Designers studied her wrecked decks, her ruptured fuel lines, her magazines that nearly consumed her completely. Every improvement that followed was built upon Franklin's charred bones. Armored decks, fire barriers, deeper magazines. She became the mother of safer carriers, a sacrifice transformed into blueprint for survival. For Japan, Franklin's survival was cruel truth incarnate, even in desperation, even using their most terrifying tactic. They could wound, but not destroy American power. The strike that hit Franklin killed hundreds, but it did not sink her. In that contrast lay the Empire's doom. Courage without numbers could burn, but it could not win wars. For America, Franklin's story transcended ships and steel. It was about men becoming extraordinary when fire closed around them. The chaplain with nothing but faith, the junior officer with nothing but determination, the sailors with nothing but water hoses and bare hands. They forged a miracle together. A survivor once said decades afterward, "We were not heroes in any traditional sense. We were just men who refused to die when death surrounded us." That refusal became Franklin's truest legacy. She was the most heavily damaged carrier ever to return to port. She bore more death than any of her sisters. Yet she floated, scarred and broken, dragged across 5,000 miles of ocean. She proved survival could be as powerful as any weapon. When she was finally decommissioned, Franklin did not fade into obscurity. She stood as monument, not gleaming in triumph, but blackened in warning. Her name carried both pride and sorrow equally. She was Big Ben, the carrier that lived through hell itself. The ship that would not sink beneath the waves. Generations later, veterans still remembered details clearly. The smoke, the heat, the screams that echoed through steel corridors. They remembered when their strength betrayed them, when their courage saved them. They remembered carrying Franklin home, and Franklin carrying their dead companions. Her legacy is not victory alone. It is fragility and endurance intertwined. Men against fire. She reminds us that even the mightiest steel bends under pressure, but human will tested in despair's crucible can outlast any flame. The USS Franklin never sailed into battle again. Yet in memory, she sailed forever. In the lessons of her sacrifice. In the truth that survival itself can echo louder than victory ever could. Franklin's death was not a single moment frozen in time. It was a chain reaction of screams, of fire, of courage stretched beyond all breaking points. 800 men stolen in seconds. Hundreds more bearing scars for the remainder of their lives. Yet the ship did not sink into the depths. Her story is not one of glory alone. It is survival itself made manifest. She was betrayed by her own strength, by bombs and fuel and steel packed tight upon her decks. But she was saved by something no machine could ever match. The refusal of men to surrender to fate. A chaplain who carried his cross into fire itself. An officer who dragged men from choking smoke. Sailors who threw burning bombs into the sea with their bare hands. These were not legends born. They were ordinary men, cooks and clerks and mechanics, who, when faced with the furnace, chose to fight rather than flee. One survivor whispered decades later with tears in his eyes, "The ship lived because we would not let her die." But every wave that carried her home also carried the voices of those we lost forever. Franklin's scars became her monument to sacrifice. She taught the Navy humility in the face of warfare's realities. She forced designers to rethink safety measures, to harden steel against flame and explosion. She reminded America that arrogance walks in power's shadow. Her legacy endures because she was more than steel and machinery. She was a question etched into history itself. How much can human beings endure when tested? What does survival truly cost? The USS Franklin never sailed into battle again after that March morning, but she sails still in every lesson learned from her pain, in every carrier built safer because of her sacrifice, in every whispered memory of fire and faith intertwined. She was Big Ben, the giant that refused to sink. She was a tomb drifting on the Pacific. She was a miracle forged in flame. She was proof that even in hell itself, steel may break and bend, but human will does not.